This is the Living Legends program. We're at the Public Library, Chickasha, Oklahoma, October the 8th, 1981. And we have Mr. Reuben M. Cochran, Cochran, and being interviewed by Lee Kopus. Here's Mr. Cochran.
My father was Richard Martin Cochran, the youngest of three sons of Holden and Maria Cochran in Kentucky. He lost his father when he was about 2 years old, and his mother when he was about, in his teens, 18 or 19 probably. And got a job in a warehouse, a tobacco warehouse. And he decided he'd like to go west. So he and another young fellow, since they didn't have hitchhiking in those days, decided to go through the country painting houses. And he ended up in Oklahoma Union, Texas, on a ranch painting, and this ranch house when fall came. So he went to work for the rancher, and the best job he ever did was when he married that rancher's youngest daughter. Her name was Cynthia Whatley. Her mother and father were Jonathan and Lucinda Melinda Borland Whatley. And at that time, my grandfather gave his children all some land and some cattle, and my mother and dad took their cattle and land, sold it, and decided to come to Indian Territory. First trip up here was in a covered wagon with my mother's younger brother when my dad came to Chickasha and found out that the Rock Island Railroad hadn't gotten this far yet. That was in 1890. So they went back and came back 2 years later and put in a general store. This store was a wooden building built up on stilts, high enough off the ground that pigs and things could run under it. And of course, Chickasha Avenue was not paved, and they didn't have any sidewalks until later on when they had boardwalks. But Chickasha Avenue would be kind of like a river when they had heavy rains, and then a big mud hole afterwards. My dad stayed in the general merchandise business until statehood, which at that time he got up the records of the owners of all of the land in Grady County, and also helped E. Sloan get up the records for Stevens County. He formed his company, was the Cochran Abstract Company, which still carries his name but is not owned by any of the members of the family. I was the middle child, and my first two children born to my mother and father had to go. My mother went back to Vernon, Texas, where there was a doctor for their birth. But by the time I came along, there was a doctor here, and I was born in Chickasha, the first one. Had also a younger brother who was born in Chickasha. Can you pause it a minute? I was born on March the 12th and attended school. 1900, yes. By the way, I was the turn of the century, and had all of my schooling here and graduated from Chickasha High School. But in 1912 and 13, my dad, along with Mr. Ike Harness, who owned a farm down south of Nennicall, and a Dr. A.S. Riddle, who was a dentist, three of them formed a Rock Creek Oil and Gas Company. And my dad did the paperwork, and Dr. Riddle did the selling, and Mr. Harness furnished the land. Not knowing much about the oil business, they sold lots, 40 by 40 feet square, just big enough to set a standard rig on to drill a well. In the agreement, they were everybody that bought a lot would participate in the first well. Well, the first well turned out to be a dry hole. My father believed in it so strongly that they skidded over, and drill a second hole. And they ran out of money, so my dad put his business in charge of one of his employees, and then he went down and worked on that rig and trying to so sure that they would find oil, but never did. But he did lose the family fortune and jewels there, so he had to come back and get to work trying to recuperate. He got into a deal with a local rancher here and a rancher out at Canyon, Texas, and it was a swap deal where he traded a New Mexico range for a Colorado range, and the Chickasha man could pay his part of the commission, but the Canyon City man couldn't pay his. So he made a deal with my dad that if we would go out and live on this ranch and sell it within 3 years, then he'd be able to pay him. And also he would ship cattle out there and they'd go in partners on the cattle business. Well, that was 1914. And 1914 was the first year they had hoof and mouth disease. But my dad and Mr. Edwards, the rancher from Canyon City, had 100 of the prettiest white-faced cattle that you ever saw ready for the Denver Fat Stock Show. But because of this hoof and mouth disease, they put a quarantine on and would not let them ship any cattle any place. So they had bought their cake to feed these cattle from Chickasha Cotton Oil Company and shipped it all the way out to Colorado. This was in the San Luis Valley, and our closest town to the ranch was the Moffett. We lived on this ranch and moved there in the summertime, and when time came to school, Mother wouldn't let us go to school in Moffett because it had a saloon. And we couldn't go to school in Alamosa, which was 30 miles, because they had saloons about every other door. But Colorado had local options, and we went to school in Monte Vista, which was 45 miles from the ranch. Well, transportation wasn't quite the same as it is today, but my dad bought a Maxwell automobile, and we'd drive that thing until it got too hot, and then we'd stop and get out and pack snow in it, the radiator, till it cooled off enough for us to go on farther. And that was only occasionally that we would get to go home to the ranch, which my younger brother and I loved. It turned out to be a very sad year for us because my father died at fall, and Mother had developed cancer and was sick in bed at the time. So when Father died, why, they decided that we'd better move back to Chickasha, which we did, and then we lost our mother in June of that year. Father died in March and Mother in June, and pretty close together. I was 15 years old. That was in March 23rd, 1915. My father died, and June the 11th when my mother died. I had never worked at all other than around the ranch or something like that. But we had an old bachelor great uncle that had lived with us, and he went downtown and got me a job working in a grocery store. And that was my first job. And then from there, that was a summertime job, and that fall I got a job working in a shoe store. And I continued working in this shoe store until I graduated from high school.
The name of the store?
I worked at first with the Sunshine Grocery, and then the Bootery, Hunter's Bootery in Chickasha. World War I came on, and Jim Hunter, the manager of the store, and George Rice, who still lives in Chickasha, were the two employees. And they both had to go to war, so they sold it to the Bootery of Oklahoma City, and they sent Mr. Roy Jones down as manager. So I asked Mr. Hunter if he'd give me a recommendation so I could go to work for Mr. Jones. He said, sure. Said, I'm paying you $3.50 a week, but you tell him I'm paying you $5. So I asked Mr. Jones for the job and got it, and I told him that he said, "How much you been making?" I said, $5 a week. Later on, he found one of their old checkbooks and found out where I'd been making $3.50 a week, and give me a good raking over and told me, he said, "I'm not going to fire you, but if you ever lie to me again, I will." But that was just a little happening. But I stayed with them until I did graduate from high school. About 1922, C.R. Anthony Company came here. So I had decided that first I would like to try real estate business. So I went to work for my uncle in the real estate business, but I wasn't making very much money. So when Anthony offered me a job as manager of their shoe department, I took that, but I wasn't very happy there because we had to work too many hours. And I went to work, as we used to kid them and say, by lantern, and came home by lantern. But it was long hours and not too much money, so I quit and went in business for myself up in Guthrie, Oklahoma. Well, I'd bought an interest in one of the Bouterie stores, which was owned by Mr. Lee Comp in Oklahoma City. And I hadn't much more gotten up there good and gotten the store remodeled and fixed up like I wanted it until I found out I'd made kind of a bad deal. But I stayed with it anyhow until 1926, and he decided to move the store to Muskogee. And I decided to get out and take my loss and leave. Then I went to Houston, decided I liked the cotton business, and I went to work for Anderson Clayton, for which my brother was working. And that worked for them one fall, and then came the slow time, and I just let off then because I was the newest man. So I went back to work for one of the small shoe chains that had just started out, and that was Paul's and Shoes Incorporated. And they sent me to San Antonio soon as a manager of a new store there. And after about a year there, they decided to put a store in Oklahoma City, and I was sent to Oklahoma City, being the only Oklahoman in the outfit, and they felt like I would do better there. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me because the oil field was just coming in Oklahoma City, and my business didn't fall off in the Depression. We came in September 29, and the stock market crash was in October of that year. So our business stayed good, where all the rest of the stores in this little chain business dropped off to beat the band. And also it was good because I met my wife, Pauline, and we were married in 1935. And in 1939, we decided we'd go in business for ourselves and found a location in Duncan, which we did. And we had a store there until 1946. We decided to put a second store in Chickasha. And Chickasha being my hometown, I decided we'd better move up there. So we kept both of those stores till 1953, and I decided that I always promised myself that I'd get out of the retail business by 1955 because I felt it was a young man's business. So I sold the store in 54 in Chickasha and kept the other one in Duncan until 1970 and sold it. But after selling the one in Chickasha, I decided to get into the home building business, which proved out to be very good for us. Pauline worked with me. She drew the plans, and we built some of the finest homes in Chickasha. Stayed in it until later on, and decided to branch off into commercial building. We remodeled the First National Bank and the Pool Mortgage Companies, and then I promised her that I'd quit in 1972 and had those two prettiest buildings down on the downtown corner. So I decided it was a good time, so I retired in 72. In the meantime, we had bought an old apartment building here, and we remodeled it and built part of it as to our home, which we still have and live there. got some, in my experiences in building, and in home building especially, where you have to work with the owners, and especially the wives of it, I always had pleasant experiences. I never had anything that was really unpleasant. And after I got into the commercial building, of course, you work with architects mostly, but I also had good relations with the owners and also with all the architects and engineers that we worked with. Some of the ways that I've served our community is that we are members of the First Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. And, I served on the Board of Deacons, and the Board of Elders, and the Board of Trustees, chairman of the board on 2 different occasions, the chairman of the Board of Trustees on 2 occasions. I also served as the treasurer of Grady Memorial Hospital from the beginning. And we had started a new hospital, you remember, without very much cash to operate on, and we had quite experience. I served the hospital for 13 years and then asked the county commissioners to appoint a younger person. I thought other people ought to be learning some things about the hospital that I had learned. I've also served on the board of directors on 2 different occasions of the Chickasha Chamber of Commerce, and on the board several times of the Chickasha Kiwanis Club. I also served as president in 1955 and 56. Still belonged to Kiwanis and as a senior member, but am pretty active and attend pretty regularly. I also served as a director of the First National Bank and Trust Company, and from about 1960 when I was elected, and we had a ruling that when you become 72 that you be made an advisory director. I was, I think, about 75 before it got my time, but I'm still serve as advisory director of the First National Bank and Trust Company in Chickasha. And back to my retail business, while I was working for Paul's Shoes Incorporated, who had their head office in Dallas, and I had a friendly relationship with the owners and officers of the company, and when I decided to go in business for myself, they were a big help to me by giving me some nice letters and introduction to some factories and shoe factories in St. Louis. So we made a trip to St. Louis and interviewed some of these factories and trying to get maybe some leads on some good places to go into business, and they advised us about a store that was for sale in Duncan, Oklahoma. So we came home and went down to Duncan and made a deal with a Mr. Blake, who lived in Chickasha but owned the store there, but had been a salesman for this Brown Shoe Company. So we went down and looked the store over and made a deal with him, and then started out as Cochran's shoe store in Duncan, and then later dropped the shoe store and called it Cochran Shoes, and also had the Cochran Shoes in Chickasha. The Brown Shoe Company was our main supplier, but we bought lots of shoes from other places, and especially during the rationing days when it was real hard to get merchandise. I would go to St. Louis and had a friend in Blackwell that had a shoe store, and we'd go up together and beat the bushes trying to find anything we could to sell. And it was real hard to find, and then especially if you go into new factories that didn't know you because they were trying to take care of their old accounts. But we did manage to have enough shoes to get along, and we went through the war years with prices increasing and being able to sell everything that we could get, which helped us a whole lot on getting started in the business. And as the war was ending and we started putting this store in Chickasha in 1946 and had to delay the opening of it because of a truck strike that was on, and we couldn't get delivery of merchandise. But we finally got delayed opening for 6 months and opened it in September of 1946, and it proved to be a real good move for us. And we hired a fine young man to run the store in Duncan, and it did a good job. While we're living in Duncan, our little daughter grew up, and that was one of the main reasons that we wanted to move to a small town, that we needed to raise our daughter in the city. But our daughter grew up, and when graduated from the Duncan High School, and of course we had saved our money trying to have enough to educate her, and we entered her in university that fall, but much against her wishes. And before the first semester was over, we finally decided to let her quit. She was calling home to her mother constantly and about making her mother sick, and so she just wanted to get married, and we let her come home, and she married Weldon Mosley, and they have been very happily married in Duncan. And of course, we have 3 fine grandchildren from that marriage, and also we have 4 great-grandchildren, and just expecting the 5th one any day now. But fortunately, the 2 girls live in Duncan, that our 2 granddaughters and their children, so we get to see them quite often. The grandson lives in St. Louis, and we don't see him so often. But they, of course, I kid and say that we count our wealth in our grandkids because we enjoy them so much. While we were living in Duncan, I did do some adult work, adult leadership in Boy Scout work, and served 1 year as the president of the Back Beaver Council for that area. When we moved up to Chickasha, we were so busy trying to get a new store going that I kind of dropped out of Scout work and weren't able to do much then. I had belonged to a Rotary Club in Duncan and had served it as president, but when we moved to Chickasha, our classification was taken. So after staying out of civic work for a while, I joined Kiwanis Club, and as I said, I was president of the year in 1955-56, and the international convention that year was in San Francisco. So another one of our members and my closest and probably best friend, that we had been friends ever since little boys, and that was Lucian Irwin. Lucian and Faye Irwin and Pauline and I took Lucian's new car, which was air conditioned, and not too many of them were at that time. Anyhow, we drove to San Francisco and had a wonderful trip out there. Had about 14,000 people attending that convention, and we got to see a lot of California. But enough of it that later on, that Ralph and Lucille Conrad and Pauline and I took a trip through the Northwest and went up into Canada. First went to the big parks in the western part of the United States, and ended up in Lake Louise, which is a most beautiful place, and then from there back to the United States, and up to Vancouver and over to Vancouver Island, and down the west coast of California, clear down to La Jolla. in San Diego. From there, then came on home. But it was a wonderful trip, over 7,500 miles. It gave us a good view of the whole western part of the United States, and probably made us appreciate Chickasha a little bit more than we had before. While in Kiwanis, I served as on several committee chairmen, and I have enjoyed all of my work in Kiwanis. It's been very pleasant, and it is. And I had a very successful year the year I was president. While working with the Boy Scouts in Duncan, we put on our annual drive, and they gave me the card of Mr. Earl Halliburton, who was the president and founder of Halliburton's Incorporated. Herb Galloway, who was the secretary to the manager of the Chamber of Commerce at the time, and I went to call on him, and we had an appointment with him and went out to see him. Told him while we were there, and he just went on telling us about the hard time he was having out in California with his luggage company. At that time, they were manufacturing airplane luggage, and it was beautiful aluminum luggage, and the union was giving him a lot of trouble, and he did not like unions and never did organize in his lifetime in his Duncan Halliburton company. But while we were there talking to him, he read us some letters from this that he had written and the union had written him, and about this negotiations they were having with the union out there. And after listening to those letters and finally getting ready to go, he called to his secretary and said, give the Boy Scouts a check for $250 on the Inc., which meant the incorporated part of the company. So after we got outside, Herb Galloway said, well, if he'd have read us one more letter, we would have gotten $375. Said $125 a letter is pretty good drive, don't you think? So that was, but Mr. Halliburton was a wonderful person and did an awfully lot of good for the company. And I knew his brother John, who was president of the company for a while after Mr. Halliburton's death. Mr. Halliburton had a little home across the street from the manufacturing plant in Halliburton's in Duncan, where he stayed when he was in Duncan. He spent most of his time in Duncan, but a great part of it was in California, where his family lived in California. Other people in Duncan that I had a close relationship. One of them was C.D. Kahn, who had been an early member of the Oklahoma Tax Commission and was a wonderful person and a wonderful friend. He was our attorney, and we lost him later after we moved to Chickasha. We made quite a lot of friends in Duncan, and most of them now are gone, such as Bill Smith, who was the president of the First National Bank, and Walter Harp, the First National Bank there. And of course we made a lot of social friends also, besides business friends. We had, let's see, got it all now. Trying to get some. There had been many changes in Chickasha since my father first drilled for oil and didn't find it, but there had been many real good wells drilled and big producers in oil and gas on the west and northwest and north and northeast of Chickasha now, as well as the southwest, had oil and gas production all around, which has been a big help to the economy of Chickasha. Plus, it has helped many of the landowners in these areas too. They've had very successful farming years because they've had the oil to help them. This I was as a small boy, Chickasha was quite a railroad town, and we had the Rock Island Roundhouse and Rock Island car shops and paint shops, and it was just a big part of our economy. I can remember on Statehood Day in 1907, the day that we became a state, the roundhouse had a big whistle and it sounded long. They also had a steam laundry at that time, and it had whistle blew, and people shot guns, and there were lots of things. Excitement went on that one day. We came from Indian Territory to the state of Oklahoma. Been many changes. We've had real good passenger car train service through Chickasha in the early days, and now then we don't even have a passenger train coming through here, and only occasional freight trains. And of course the Rock Island is bankrupt, and it is out of business. Frisco still operates freight trains through here, but no passenger train service at all. I've had a lot of changes in my lifetime that I've seen and things, and when Chickasha didn't even have a doctor, now we have a fine hospital and some very fine specialists and doctors here. That, of course, there's been many changes in medicine, and it has been, we're quite a little medical center serving the.
There is no sign-off for this interview. It simply stops in the middle of a sentence, and there is no indication anywhere that this interview is continued on any other tape.